A picture may be worth 1,000 words, but in this year's budget a phrase repeated 51 times paints a vivid picture. The phrase "is funding for this measure" has already been provided for, and a Control-F search of budget paper 2 from the previous 10 budgets reveals its generous use this year. The phrase appeared 30 times in last year's budget, just a dozen times the year before that, and it didn't appear at all in Wayne Swan's last 2 budgets, or in Joe Hocker's first after Tony Abbott led the coalition to victory over Labour in 2013. So what does it mean and why is it important? Budget Paper 2 is the go-to document for anyone interested in policy announcements. It details all new spending since the last budget update, and helps journalists, experts and the public in general determine whether money for a program is new or additional, or whether it is old and has been recycled from somewhere else or simply been re-announced. There's been a long history of, like, the same dam being announced 10 times, and this sort of thing, explains John Hawkins, a former Treasury official who is now a senior lecturer at the Canberra School of Politics, Economics and Society and NATSM within the University of Canberra. But, yeah, there seems to have been even more sort of trickery. The phrases "funding for this measure" has already been provided for, and "partial funding for this measure" has already been provided for are central to this trickery. Inside Budget Paper 2. To understand how, you first need to understand a bit about Budget Paper 2. It has tables setting out the spending and revenue changes from policy decisions since the last budget, or mid-year economic and fiscal outlook that look something like this. The Budget Paper 2 outline of Project Red Spice. An experienced budget watcher would notice immediately that most of the extra money going to the Australian Signals Directorate is coming straight out of the Department of Defence. So Red Spice is mostly a reallocation of existing defence funding rather than extra money being provided for national security by the government. The total increase in spending to defence, at least up to 2025-26, is minuscule compared with the billions of dollars that were being talked about in the budget speech, observes independent economist Saul Eslake, who started off as a Treasury official helping to write budgets in the 1980s and has been watching them ever since. He says there's no fundamental problem with so-called old money being reallocated. Indeed, you would like to think that every year part of the budgetary process is for the government, for Treasury and Finance, and for ministers to sit down and say, is every dollar we're currently spending being well spent? And are there things that we're currently spending money on where the money could be better spent elsewhere? At least in the case of Red Spice, we know that's what's happening. The government has decided that cybersecurity is an urgent priority, so it's pulling money from other parts of defence to beef it up. But compare that to the billion-dollar increase in funding to protect the Great Barrier Reef, announced publicly with much fanfare in late January. This is how it appears in Budget Paper 2. The Budget Paper 2 entry on increased Great Barrier Reef funding. Where's the rest of the $1 billion, you might ask? The answer is we don't know. That's because this was one of the policies for which partial funding for this measure has already been provided for by the government. In this case, partial seems to equal almost the whole amount. It's likely that all, or at least most, of this money was included in December's MYEFO as a decision taken, but not yet announced. That means it's not new money, and more precise details of when and how it will be allocated don't have to be provided in Budget Paper 2. But, because the policy decision hadn't been announced before MYEFO, that document also didn't provide any breakdown of when and how the money would be spent. That means we have no idea if any of the $1 billion, beyond the $12.4 million of tourism operator fee relief slated for 2022-23, will be spent within the next 4 years, or whether it's all way off in the future. The whole point of Budget Paper 2 is to provide this sort of information about what the measures are, how much they are worth, and also how they are spread over time, says Dr. Hawkins. Increasingly, too, when they are saying about how much we're spending on something, they give a figure that's over 4 years, or sometimes over 10 years. And it sort of makes a difference, whether it's money that's actually going to be spent in the next year, or whether it's something they're promising that the government elected after the election after next will spend. It's not terribly satisfactory, to put it mildly. This treatment also means that it's impossible to be sure whether the REEF money is genuinely new, additional environmental spending, or rather a reallocation from an existing program, shifting the same pot of money somewhere else. Trend away from transparency. December's MyEFO contained a record $16 billion in the combined bucket of decisions taken, but not yet announced, and figures not for publication, usually due to commercial inconfidence or national security reasons. At the press conference following MyEFO, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg was quizzed about whether this was a secret spendathon to win the next election. They are measures that we expect to eventuate, but at this point, we can't allocate and confirm to specific programs, he responded, citing uncertainty around the COVID situation as a major factor. However, over the past few years, unlike Wayne Swan's last couple of budgets, or Joe Hocker's first, where the phrase "decisions taken not yet announced" appeared occasionally, there are no details provided in budget paper about when and whether funding for these measures had already been budgeted. I think there's been a general trend, over the last decade or so, for more of those things to be classified as NFP without, I think, sufficient justification or explanation, observes Sawless Lake, adding that national security had become an increasingly common excuse. The expectation is that as soon as someone mentions the word security, we're all supposed to turn our brains off, salute, and say, "Yes, sir," to whatever the government proposes. As for whether the missing information can be obtained outside of the budget, the press releases that budget paper too regularly directs readers to generally contain scant extra detail, not that they could be readily accessed inside the budget lockup anyway. Opposition senators could ask at Senate estimates for more information about it, explains Dr. Hawkins. Now, that may well then get taken on notice, and it could be quite a slow process, but that might eventually get the information out. However, as Sawless Lake observes, by the time those details have emerged, attention has faded. An awful lot of the budget process these days is now about enabling the government to manage the flow of information, he says. To put things out before the budget is formally brought down in a way that maximizes the opportunities for favorable coverage, while minimizing the opportunity for people who actually know a lot about the budget and the way it's put together to pick things up and talk about them, either themselves or in conversations with journalists, at a time when the focus is on the budget. Most of these things do come out eventually, but they come out with a lag at a time when the caravan has moved on. Worse, just before an election. Dr. Hawkins says, unsurprisingly, governments seem to increase their use of these sort of budget accounting tricks before facing voters. I suspect it's probably worse, just before an election, he says. But I think, in addition to that sort of cyclical element, I think there's a sort of a trend move away from transparency. I think Howard and Costello deserve praise for introducing the Charter of Budget Honesty, which certainly was a big improvement in a lot of these matters. But I think we're possibly moving a bit backwards since. Sawless Lake broadly agrees that many things are better than when he worked in Treasury in the 1980s. But some have gone backwards, with the states and territories now offering more budget transparency than the federal government. The Commonwealth budget papers, when I first started doing these things, used to be the best in the country. They are not anymore, he laments. Things are better than they were, but they still could be a lot better than they currently are. A spokesperson for the Treasurer said all of his budgets complied with legal obligations. The budget and the three previously delivered by the Treasurer have been done in accordance with the Charter of Budget Honesty. Expert access denied. The government has also, over the past few years, tightened up restrictions on the number of external experts media outlets can take into the budget lockup. Several economists that the ABC requested to take in this year were knocked back by Treasury, and the same thing happened last year. Sawless Lake was not one of them, but has been inside the media lockup with the ABC previously, and says allowing experts in had been a relatively recent exception to a long-standing practice. Governments usually don't allow people who know a lot about the budget into the lockup, he notes. No treasurer or finance minister wants his